Paul Harrell, weekdays from 4 to 6. Learn more at paulharrell.com.
A tax force has been meeting down at the Marble Palace for the last couple of days. Here with a Marble Palace update, somebody who has attended both of those meetings yesterday and today, we have Mr. Josh Waters from Political Strategies back on the program. Josh, thanks again for coming on.
Hey, Paul. How's it going?
It's going good. And I also want to thank you again for guest hosting the program on Friday. I got to listen to a little bit of it off and on. I was barbecuing for a family event, and I really enjoyed it. And so I just want to say thank you.
Oh, yeah. It was an honor to step in for you. Hopefully I didn't scare off too many of your listeners, and they're still tuning in today.
Well, I think we're doing good. So I don't think you have anything to worry about there. Josh, I've spoken with you a little bit yesterday, just you and me, about what happened at the tax force, as I'm starting to call it, because I feel like they really want to raise revenue. And we do have a few articles out in the Gazette about this, that the consultant, Randy Bauer, they're wanting now to sift through sales tax exemptions. What can you tell us about yesterday? Let's start with what they talked about yesterday, and then let's talk about what they talked about today. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, yesterday was basically all about sales and use tax, and then specifically exemptions and what the cost of those were. So, they started off very basic, talking generally about sales tax and, the rate in Arkansas, which we know is 6.5%. He also mentioned about how the state and local combined sales tax rate in Arkansas is third highest in the nation. That's a tax foundation statistic there. And so they really went through about the sales tax rates and how those compare to other states. And then they did get into some of the sales tax exemptions. And that was really, I think coming in what a lot of the members of the task force were interested in, kind of knowing the value of what those were. And so they actually had some data from 2011 about the cost or how much revenue is not taken in because of those exemptions that they would take in if they weren't in place. And so Josh, that number was $1.4 billion.
Did anybody
sales tax exemption.
Did anybody say, "Hey, why don't we have any current data?" I mean, that's like 6 or 7 years ago. Like, what's wrong? Why don't we have current data?
Yeah, that came up actually probably maybe 2 or 3 times during the day. Some of the data that was shown during the presentation was pretty old. And so they did request, the task force did request that they redo those numbers and update those. So I know that's something DFNA, I guess working with the Randy Bauer and the consultants will work on, trying to get some newer data. And then also of those exemptions, what can they actually, do with those numbers? Because some of the exemptions are under the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution or the Arkansas Constitution. So it's not like they can get all that $1.4 billion in revenue that they're not getting. But going back to your point in your question, there was several instances where the data seemed kind of old. Or they needed more data or more information, more dollar figures they can assign to this. So that's something the way they explained it was there'd be a written memo sent to the task force members following up on questions from the last 2 days of meetings. So hopefully we can get a copy of that report and they can address those questions.
I'm reading here in the Gazette article about this particular task force meeting. They mentioned the chairman, the governor's nephew, several times, Senator Jim Hendren, also the majority leader in the Senate. And it seems like he wants a study done. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here. He wants a study done as to what the scenario would be if they eliminated all exemptions on the sales tax, and then how much money would they get, and then how much money could they then cut income taxes? He's quoted in the newspaper saying, quote, "But I just wanted to know myself, if you really wanted to go for it and say we're eliminating all sales tax exemptions, what would your tax code look like? You can see you could cut in half," he said. It was just really an exercise in math to let folks see that even $100 million isn't going to move the needle much on the top rate. Moving down the top rate takes a lot of dollars, is what he says. What are your thoughts on Senator Jim Hendren and what you heard him say in person yesterday?
Yeah, well, honestly, that was probably one of the better portions of yesterday's meeting. You know, and one of the few times I've heard, okay, if we're going to get all this new revenue, how much can we reduce rates by? And so before we broke for lunch yesterday, Senator Hendren asked DFNA to run those numbers and bring them back after lunch. And when they ran those numbers, let me look back at my notes here. They ran the numbers, and basically it was about if they did all the sales tax exemptions, which they admitted they can't do, but, you know, hypothetically, that $1.4 billion number, they could basically reduce the amount of income taxes that they collect in half if they put, you know, if they wanted to be revenue neutral.
Of course.
So let me see if I can find those numbers, because they're actually, you know, go ahead.
No, I would say the Gazette is reporting on 10 of the exemptions accounted for $1.1 billion in reduced revenue in 2011. And so they talk about the gasoline and motor fuel, on which gas or fuel tax has been paid, costing $325 million. But we already, so they're saying that that's an exemption, but yet we already have gas taxes. I mean, if they were to get rid of that exemption, that would, in my opinion, be a double taxation on gas. You've got...
Yes.
Go ahead, talk about that if you want.
No, that's a really good point. And that actually came up yesterday. You say that's an exemption, but like you said, we have an excise tax, which we're talked about in today's meeting. And so the excise tax is the per gallon amount. I think it's like 21.5 cents per gallon amount. And so they have that as excise tax. So saying it's an exemption, you know, that they can say that, but if they took away that exemption, like you said, it would almost be double taxation. But I found these numbers here. They said if they were able to take that $1.4 billion, and I think that $1.1 billion number was like the top 10 exemptions. That was in one of the slides. But I think the total from that 2011 estimate was $1.4 billion. And they said, okay, if we took all that money and cut income tax rates with it, then they would have three rates of 1%, 3%, 3.5%. The 1% rate wouldn't kick in until $8,400, and then the 3% rate would kick in at $35,100. So that would be, you know, that would be true significant tax relief to a lot of Arkansans.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's kind of a hypothetical. They can't reduce that number by that amount just from the sales tax exemptions, but it gives you an idea of, you know, the real relief that is out there if, you know, in my opinion, they're willing to cut spending, couple that with
they have to cut spending. Yeah, they have to, and we have to understand that the people of Arkansas, I mean, they're wanting more revenue because, you know, they want to reform. That is what they say. They want to reform taxes, but they want to protect the government nest egg, whatever they're currently getting now. They want to make sure that they're getting that same amount in the future, and you know, that to me is troublesome. It really truly is troublesome. It's not necessarily an exemption game. Not necessarily that I'm opposed to doing that, but are you willing to cut spending, what the government's spending now, to free up money? And they just don't seem to have a capacity to do that. I mean, is there anybody out there proposing a bold idea of eliminating Arkansas's income tax altogether, like other states? You know, I mean, I don't think that they're even talking about that, are they?
No, that hasn't come up. Not in the last 2 days when I was there, and I don't remember hearing it at any other meeting before now.
Yeah.
You know, there was emphasis on, you know, income tax and sales tax are the two biggest revenue sources for Arkansas. So to completely eliminate the income tax, they would, you know, either have to cut spending significantly or make it up somewhere else. So,
right, of course, and I think that would be a productive discussion to have as well. So we're talking with Josh Waters from Political Strategy. So you say the first day was on sales taxes and everything else, and the second day, today's meeting was on excise taxes. Now, was there any new data? Did they have any new data from different years today? Because, it sounds to me like, if you're trying to make decisions based on 2011, it'd be nice to be able to make decisions based on the last fiscal year that we have. But was there any shift in that, or still using old numbers?
I guess today it wasn't as an intensive report. So some of the numbers were more current. They were using the tax handbook that BLR puts out. That was a lot of the source information from today. And so they did talk about excise taxes. So for most people who don't know what that is, that's kind of, kind of explained as the sin taxes to an extent, taxes, a certain specific amount rather than necessarily a specific rate in some situations on cigarettes, on alcohol. An excise tax that we've talked about, the premium insurance tax, the motor fuel tax, the price per gallon on that. So those are the excise taxes that they talked about today. But one thing I think people should be aware of, though, and it was in yesterday's meeting, is there's still this big push for the idea of getting revenue from an internet sales tax. Now, yesterday, I thought one good thing was they did talk about the legal distinction between a sales tax and a use tax, and how that's playing out in different states, and the inability to force out-of-state sellers to collect and remit. And I know you talked about this on your program a lot, but this is something that's not going away. The internet sales tax, they're trying to find ways around it, the legal standard, through an economic nexus standard they want to implement, or through regulations or definition changes from the kind of the bureaucracy level of government. They're looking at what other states are doing to get that source of revenue and to get more revenue into the state. So I do want to, let your listeners know to still, be aware of that is still going on. They're still researching how much money they can get from that going forward.
Yeah, and that's a problem. We mentioned that a little bit yesterday. They're wanting more money from us, and this is a proposal that's already been rejected by the people's representatives. They couldn't get it through, and so now they're still considering it. They're still talking about it. They really do want this increase in revenue, and they want to be able to be sovereign over businesses outside of the state of Arkansas that don't have a physical location here, which is a dangerous precedent. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Matter of fact, I did read somewhere, Josh, I'm sure you read this too, where Arkansas is now participating. Is it a lawsuit, or is it an appeal to try to get that power on other states?
Yeah. So I talked about that Friday on the show when I was filling in for you. That the state of Arkansas has basically signed on to this lawsuit, saying, "Hey, the U.S. Supreme Court, please take up the South Dakota case." As we know, the South Dakota law, the internet sales tax law they passed, was basically the same as Senate Bill 140 this last Arkansas legislative session. And the state Supreme Court in South Dakota struck it down, saying it's unconstitutional. You can't do this, upholding Quill versus North Dakota. So several states, including Arkansas, have signed on to a challenge to the U.S. Supreme Court, basically encouraging the Supreme Court to relook at this issue. And, ultimately that's what Arkansas was trying to do, because they admitted it in during the session that it was unconstitutional. They'd have to go through legal proceedings to get this overturned at the U.S. Supreme Court. So, but yeah, that's unfortunate to see. I think that, I talk about the poll numbers. People, Arkansans, when they're polled, they reject the idea of the internet sales tax. The state legislature just rejected it. The people's representative voted it down. And at the end of the day, I think people are, fed up. They don't want the government with more money. They want money less in their pocket.
And that's the whole thing here. The question is, how much money do the people of Arkansas want to give the government? And right now, we're giving them a lot. Do we want to give them more? And that's the issue here. Is I think a lot of people are weary that whatever recommendations they have, they're going to make sure they protect what the government's getting now, and we may end up with a military retirement issue where we actually have, when they're going to be getting more money, and because we know that they have, obligations to pay welfare and everything else. A quote from this article We've got people upset with, the Supreme Court's precedent here on sales tax on the internet. Quote, the problem with the physical presence rule is that it was first conceived of in 1967, 2 years before the moon landing and decades before the first retail transaction occurred over the internet. And, that may be true. Like, they're trying to say, well, technology has, outthought the government. And maybe that's true. Maybe it has. But the government is getting record revenue. All governments are getting record revenue. And it just, first of all, the state of Arkansas shouldn't have sovereignty over some business in Indiana or California, just like California shouldn't have sovereignty over some business in Arkansas. And there's a real issue of sovereignty here in the individual states maintaining that. And these legislators who are for internet sales tax, they don't care about that. And they're actually weakening us and empowering other states, and it's very, very frustrating. Man, we're out of time, Josh Waters. I appreciate you being on the program. I'll give you the last word, just real quick. Your overall general feel the 2 days down at the Marble Palace, in front of the tax force.
Overall, I thought it was a lot of data, a lot of information. But what's actually going to happen from this? I think the jury's still out on that. They're going to be meeting again next month, and then they'll have a preliminary report at the end of this year, and then they'll keep meeting through next year. So, again, the last 2 days, a lot of data on sales tax and excise taxes. Next month, be focused on property tax. I have a feeling Municipal League is supposed to be there, so there'll probably still be more talk about internet sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
So I just encourage people to keep listening to your show. And keep, reading over at conductforaction.org to get information about what they're trying to do with our money down there.
All right. I sure will. Josh Waters from Political Strategies, thanks so much for being on the program, and certainly we'll keep up with it. I appreciate it, sir.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
All righty, folks. Yeah, I'll just say this one thing.